Well, if you want to take your Bibles right now, we're going to look this morning. We're taking a break from Revelation and looking at Titus chapter 2. Turn to Titus chapter 2. We'll begin with a verse up here on the screen, Deuteronomy 5:16, which says, "Honor your father and mother, as the Lord your God commanded you. Then you will live a long and full life in the land the Lord your God will give you." We hear a lot these days about the rise of China in world politics and Russia and the political power being shifted back and forth across the nations of the world. But at the moment, the United States is still the number one superpower in the world. And I think we've all seen those lists of papers that say the list of factors, rather, that talk about what happens as a nation is in decline. One of those lists, the 7 common factors of nations in decline. Number 1, existence of easy divorce. Number 2, public disrespect toward parents. Number 3, disrespect toward marriage. Number 4, common acceptance of adultery. Number 5, rebellion against parents. Number 6, rapid rise of juvenile delinquency. And number 7, acceptance of sexual perversion. The bad news is, how many of these signs do we see in the United States? Every single one. The good news is that this morning we have taken steps to slow that decline away. This morning we have publicly honored grandparents who are, by definition, parents as well. And the whole idea is that we are helping, through what we just did and have done, a little through the sermon, we're helping reverse the trend toward decline. As we honor parents and grandparents, then that rubs off on the way of our attitudes and the way we speak out in the public place, in school and work, in our neighborhoods. That helps change people's attitudes, change people's minds, and helps slow down the slide and maybe even reverse some of it in what is going on in America. So for this Grandparents' Day, we are going to look at 2 short messages from God on elderly folks. And it's one of the messages, half of the sermon is going to be directed toward grandparents and what you need to hear from God. The other half of the sermon is directed toward those who are not grandparents and what God has to say about the subject. So all of this, number 1, done in order to please God, but number 2, also done in order to change our nation. As we, remember, 2 of those had to do with attitudes toward parents. As we change that, we help slow down the decline of our nation and bring great blessing. So let's begin with a short message to God's message to grandparents. How many grandparents do we have here today? Could you put your hands up, grandparents? How many? Yeah, there's more than 60 apparently. Grandparents, have you ever wondered, as you look at the current generation of people, young people, you wondered yourself, how in the world are they going to make it? You look at our culture and how it's just going downhill, and you look at the kids and you think, how are they going to do this? How are they going to survive? There's an answer to that. And one of the key answers to that is you. See, God intends for grandparents to be influencers on the current generation of those people who are in the action. Most elderly people are, feel like, well, I've done my duty. I used to be in the thick of things, and now I'm toward the end. I'm no longer an influence. And God says, what? Are you kidding me? Absolutely not. God says, you're not done. You're influencing in a different way, but you're not done. You're not set on the shelf and unimportant. You have an important role to fill. You as an influencer upon the present generation that is in the thick of the mix and making all the decisions and running most of the things going on. Just because your time has moved on to another stage doesn't mean you're not influential or unimportant. And that's what we have here in Titus chapter 2. In Titus chapter 2, we have God's standards for grandparents. God's standards for grandparents, for all who are elderly. We need to live up to these standards. Number one, to please God, but also to help fix this nation. God says, your role is not done yet. And he specifically gives in Titus chapter 2 standards for grandparents to follow. The question is, are you going to live up to those standards? Will you take God's words here seriously and make sure your life is living by that standard? Because when you do, then you help influence the present generation of those who are running things and in the thick of it and helping pull things up and not pull it down. So let's start with looking at Titus chapter 2. It begins with 6 standards for grandfathers and all older men. 6 standards for grandfathers. Look at verses 1 and 2. Titus 2. But as for you, Titus, speak the things which are fitting for sound doctrine. Older men are to be temperate, dignified, sensible, sound in faith, in love, and in perseverance. Okay, here we have God's 6 standards for grandfathers and all older men. Very specifically laid out here. This is for the older men. And in Titus's day, an older man would be anyone who was over 50. What God has the standards for the older men. Doesn't give these to the younger men, doesn't give the younger women, or even to the older women. God says, I have 6 standards that I want the older men to live up to. So older men, listen. Number 1 has to do with the subject of alcohol, as it says there in that verse. Number 1, it uses the word sober or temperate. What does that mean? In the United States, the statistics say that 1 out of every 12 men abuses alcohol. Uses it in a bad way in their life. And what God's standard here for being sober or temperate simply means to control. And write this down in your insert. God's standard for older men and alcohol is control. It's got to be controlled. The New Testament does not forbid drinking. It does not forbid drinking, but when it talks about drinking, it always deals with this subject of control. It must be controlled, controlled. When alcohol is not controlled, God says that's sin. And it must not be done again. We all know, we've seen it and maybe even experienced it, where it gets out of control and out of hand. God says that is not, especially for the older men. Number 1, when people describe your relationship with alcohol, they should use the word control. That's what God says. Number 2, let's look at the second description. The second description has to do with overall lifestyle. When people describe your overall life, there is a word that they should use. It's translated here differently in different translations. King James says grave. Other translations say dignified. Other ones worthy of respect. It all means respectable. Write that word respectable in your insert. God's standard for your overall life is that you are to be respectable. The opposite is to be shameful, embarrassing, dishonorable. God says, older men, when people describe your life, the overall life, they should use the word respectable. You're a respectable person. Number 3, God's standard has to do with the subject of decision-making. The verse uses words like sensible or self-controlled. It all just means careful. Write the word careful in there. God's standard for decision-making is you're a careful decision-maker. You're wise. You're thoughtful. You aren't hasty. You aren't thoughtless. You aren't just, making a decision because we've got to make a decision. Wise and thoughtful and careful. The word people should use to describe your decision-making, older man, is he's a careful about the decision he makes. Standard number 4 is the subject of God himself. And what does it say? It says sound in faith. And faith just means trust. Our standard for God is we trust him. We trust him. The opposite, it means we doubt God. We waver about God. We question and don't really know how we feel about God in his ways. This is very clear here. It's got to be trust. Now, it doesn't mean you won't feel doubt. Of course you're going to feel doubt as you're going through life and you're dealing with subjects about God. Satan's going to make sure you feel doubt. He's going to throw that into you as you're lined up for a surgery. He's going to make you feel doubtful. But it's what you do next that is sinful. It's not a sin to feel doubt. It's what you do with that feeling. And God says what I want you to do is you kill that feeling of doubt and you choose confidence. I choose to trust God. I choose to have my faith in him. I could let doubt just take over and worry me and cause me to lose sleep. I kill that and I choose trusting God because he loves me. He works all things together for good. He's going to be there for me through this. So older men, what is supposed to describe your relationship with God? Trust. Trust in God. The next standard has to do with your standard for people. What does God expect for you in relationship to people? It says, sound in love. And God's love simply means others first. That's what God's love is. Love is not primarily a warm, emotional feeling. That is not what God is telling us to do when he tells us to love others. He means put other people first. That means you have to put yourself behind them. They get to be first. That's why Jesus died on the cross. He put us ahead of himself. He says, as we go out into the world every day, we are supposed to consider others as more important than ourselves and put them first in the decisions we make. So when older men, people describe your relationship with other people in your life, they should say, you know what? He consistently puts other people first. That's what's supposed to describe him. Then the last one is the standard for hardship. Hardship. The verse uses the words patience or endurance or perseverance. And all those words really sum up to mean you keep moving forward in hardship. You keep moving forward in hardship. That's what perseverance is. That's what endurance is. The opposite is it gets hard and you quit. You give up. You just walk away. Yeah, we're not going to deal with this. It's too hard. That's not the mark of a godly man. God says the mark of a godly man, the description of your response to hardship is he consistently keeps moving forward when it gets hard. Doesn't mean there's never a time to call it quits. But it means that as you meet resistance, you don't just immediately throw up your hands. You move forward. So those are God's 6 standards for older men. And he says, I want you to live by this. You're not done with your life. You're not set on a shelf. You need to influence the younger generation by living these 6 different ways. How about women? It goes on in verses 3 to 5 to give God's standards for grandmothers and all older women. Okay, look at verse 3. It says, older women likewise are to be reverent in their behavior, not malicious gossips, nor enslaved to much wine, teaching what is good, so that they may encourage the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be sensible, to be pure, to be workers at home, kind, being subject to their own husbands, so that the word of God will not be dishonored. All right. Ready, ladies? Older women, and all grandmothers. There are 4 standards here. 4 standards here. First one has to do with your overall lifestyle. It uses the word reverent. Now, what does it mean? Your overall lifestyle is supposed to be reverent. What do you think of when you hear the word reverence or reverent? One of the pictures that comes to my mind is walking into the silence of a huge church sanctuary. And it's empty and it's silent. What happens when you walk down the aisle of a big building like that? You tend to whisper, right? Why? Because you're realizing this isn't an ordinary building. This is a building dedicated to God. And there's a reverence you show in a building like that. That's what God is saying here, older women, about your lives. You're supposed to realize you don't have an ordinary life. Your life is supposed to be dedicated to God. And that you should have a reverence about yourself as you make decisions, as you make plans, as you spend your money, as you interact with people. There should be an understanding is you're not ordinary. And you don't live ordinary. When people describe your overall life, they might use a whole bunch of different descriptions, but one of them should be you're reverent about your dedication to God. Reverence, God says here. That's the first one. Your overall lifestyle is reverence. Reverence. Number 2, The second of four deals with the standard for bad news. That's interesting, isn't it? God says, not a gossip. And that's what bad news is. When it comes to bad news, do not spread it. Do not spread it, it says. Men, when they get angry, tend to attack with their bodies. Fierce, aggressive. They say women, when they tend to attack, don't tend to attack with their bodies. They attack with their words. They attack people's reputations. They attack their, they go after a person with their mouths. And God says here, women, make sure when you hear bad news about someone, you don't attack with it. You do not spread it. We live in a world where, my goodness, bad news is on every side. Just, open up the newspaper, you'll hear about some person who's done something horrible or terrible, get a break room at work, some person who's done something shocking, and the temptation is run out and tell other people about it. Can you believe what this person did? God says there's one question you have to ask yourself when you hear bad news about someone else, and that is there a need for others to know this? Is there a need to know? Most often there is not a need to know. And when that's the case, God says just keep your mouth shut. You don't want people talking about some of the bad, stupid things you've done, right? You don't want that. God says do that for others. Unless there's a need to know, when you hear bad news, just let it go. Keep your mouth shut. Do not spread it. That's what God says. The third standard that God deals with here is the same for the older man. It has to do with alcohol, and it's the subject of make sure it's under control. When you lose control of alcohol, you sin, and you must not repeat that sin. That's what God says. Very easy to do. God says, I'm serious about it. And then the last standard number 4, has to do with younger women. What is going to be your relationship with younger women? And God very specifically here says, I want you to teach what is good. Older women, you have a lifetime of experiences of learning what works and what doesn't work, what's bad and what's good, what's wise and what's foolish. God says, I do not want you sitting on that. I want you passing that on to the younger women in your life. You are not done. You need to be teachers. You need to be telling them, number one, about how to have a right relationship with your husband and your children and homemaking and decision-making in your own personal private life. God says, you've learned, you pass it on. That doesn't mean you grab every young woman and start shaking your finger and telling them what to do. But it means you, out of love, look for opportunities to be able to share with the young woman the things that you have learned. God intends you to do that. That's just not, hey, that would be kind of nice. This is a command. This is a command that you're supposed to be doing this. And that means young ladies, be willing to listen. Don't roll your eyes and say, I don't need to hear, I got all that. Listen. Maybe you have heard 90% of it, but what about that 10% you haven't heard? Maybe you disagree, but listen and then reflect and ask God, let me understand what you were speaking to me through that older woman. If there was anything I needed to hear, bring it to my heart. Because you don't want to just dismiss, that older woman, she's out of touch. And come on. God says, open your ears. And for older ladies, open your mouths. Speak about the good things that you've learned. And what's the result? It says there at the very end that God will be honored. See, there's a lot of younger women who aren't living the way in Titus's day, weren't living the right way. Older women needed to help guide them, steer them in all these important areas of life. And when they weren't doing it, then these younger women who were Christians were getting dishonor brought on them for their bad behavior. Other non-Christians were looking and saying, well, if that's the way God is, I don't want to be a part of that. So he's saying, older women, train the younger women so they live the right way, and it brings honor to God. So older ladies, your description with younger ladies should be you're a teacher of what's good. Take that seriously. So that's God's message to grandparents and all older people. These are the standards God wants you living by. We've ripped through them quickly because of time. But do you see any on there that you need to add to your life? Any changes you need to make? Remember, our generation's not done with you. You don't just get to retire and sit back and now it's all over. You have work to do, and it's up here. And a lot of it's through your example, but some of it's through your actions. This is what God is sending you today. These are what you need to do. Do you need to improve any areas here? Make sure you improve them. Now we're going to move to the area of God's message for younger people. What does God have to say to the younger people? How many people are not grandparents here? Not grandparents. Put your hands up. Come on, don't be shy. All right, this is for you. Listen to what God has to say here. Our culture stresses being strong and fit and healthy, doesn't it? That's a big deal. And so when people become no longer strong, fit, or healthy, our culture tends to say, well, okay, we'll put you over here. And the people who are strong, fit, and healthy, they're going to be the ones doing all the stuff. God says you must have a completely different attitude toward the elderly. You cannot follow that example of your culture in this thing. Let me show you a verse we've looked at before, but it's a really good reminder. Here's a command of God to Israel. A command, Leviticus 19:32. Rise in the presence of the aged. Show respect for the elderly. And revere your God. I am the Lord. What is God saying is supposed to do here as you are in a room and an older person comes in? The command, not the suggestion, or if you feel like it, or if it's convenient. For Israel, the command was to rise in order to show them respect and reverence and honor. That was true in the Egyptian culture, in the Greek culture, and in the Roman culture. It was illegal in Roman culture for young men to stay seated when an older man came into the room. Illegal. Why? Because they wanted to show them respect. Because it's easy to just say, you're not part of the mainstream anymore, and to dishonor. God himself says, that's not going to happen with my people. You're going to honor the people that are older than you. Does God command us in the New Testament that we have to stand up? No, that is not repeated, and that's not something that if you don't stand up in the presence of an older person that you are committing a sin. However, God does give one broad principle that is repeated over and over and over, and we've read it this morning, Matthew 15:4. Honor your father and mother, 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 honor your father and mother. 6 times it's repeated in the New Testament. Honor. And so in your insert, God's standard for younger people, for their parents and grandparents, is honor. Write that down. Honor. Honor. What is the definition of honor? To honor means to treat something as valuable. To treat something as valuable. That's what honor means. Write that down. To treat something as valuable. If I pull out of my pocket here a baseball-sized diamond, okay, and it starts hitting the lights and it starts spreading all over the room and you're like, whoa. Most of you probably want to come up and look at this because it's so valuable. And we might even have to get, sell tickets and, rope off of the aisles because other people would hear and they'd want to come honor this thing because it's so valuable. That is what God is saying to do for the elderly in your life. Honor them as extremely valuable. That's what God says to do. Honor them as extremely valuable. And if you don't, well, look at what God told Israel in Deuteronomy 27:16. Cursed is he who dishonors his father and mother. Dishonor then would be, you're not valuable. I'm not going to treat you as valuable. So in Israel, if you did not treat your mother and father as valuable, then God says, I'm going to curse your life. You are under my extreme displeasure and discipline because you are not treating your parents as valuable. God's very serious about that in the Old Testament. What do you do if your parents live in a dishonorable way? Face it, every single parent blows it. Every single parent has regrets and things they shouldn't have done and ways they shouldn't have acted. It's very easy for a child to say, well, my parent isn't as valuable as they could have been. What do you do then? God says, look, number one, we're all flawed, so it isn't like there's the perfect parent and only those ones get to be honored. You honor the person's position, no matter what. In your life, there is only one set of biological parents, only one couple. And all the human beings on earth, one couple. God says you treat them as special because they are special. There's no other two human beings on earth that are like that. You treat them as special. Whether or not they treat you well, you treat them well because they are special. They are unique. No one else in the world is like them. You're supposed to play favorites with them and treat them as especially honorable and valuable in your life because of who they are. Honoring them can be done in 100 different ways. You can actually rise and stand up when they come into the room. That's a very nice way to honor them. You can give them, elderly people, you can give them the seat on public transportation, the best seat in the room. You can let them go ahead of you in line at the church supper. There's a whole bunch of ways you can honor them. One of the bigger ways is you can just be sensitive to their difficult circumstances. A lot of young people get impatient and cranky about the older people in their life because of the way they're acting. I shared before, I heard about a high school teacher who wanted to help his students understand older people better, so they showed up in class one day. He had earmuffs for everybody. He said, put them on. Dark glasses, put them on. Mittens, put them on. He says, you aren't allowed to take those off for 24 hours till we come back tomorrow morning. And the whole point is, this will begin to give you an idea of what it's like to be elderly, who can't see well, can't hear well, can't feel well. He said those students came back the next day, man. They had an enormous appreciation for how difficult it is to get old. And it gave them more patience when they dealt with the elderly. Young people, many elderly people just have a hard time getting out of a chair, getting into a car, going out at night, going out in bad weather. You probably never think about those things. It's a big challenge for a lot of older people. And you will honor them by being sensitive to that instead of impatient with it. To be sensitive when they aren't feeling well. And you can help them along. So, young people, this is what God says. The one word that should sum up your relationship with older people, the one word that is your standard for the older people in your life is you're to honor them by treating them as valuable. Honor should be your descriptive word for the older people in your life, and particularly your parents and grandparents. So, on this Grandparents' Day, we've had two messages, one for grandparents and one for everyone else. God cares, and God values the elderly and grandparents among us. Grandparents today, thank you so much for being a part of our church. Your wisdom and your experience is still greatly needed. We are not putting you on a shelf. We need and want you as participating and helping us with your years of experience. You have more time than a lot of people to serve and to pray, like a lot of younger people who are just busy from one moment, the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed. Use that to benefit our church, our congregation, in prayer and serving and helping and being available. Today we honor you, and we thank God for you. And I know Jesus honors you and thanks you as well for all your service that you've done in our church.